My son sent the message at 6:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee, watching the light come in through the back window the way it does in October. Low and slow, like it's not sure it wants to be here either. I had my reading glasses on. I was going through the electric bill. Nothing dramatic, just a Thursday. The phone buzzed on the table and I picked it up without thinking. Dad, we talked it over and we think it's better if you don't come to Thanksgiving this year. Diane's parents are flying in and things are just easier this way. Hope you understand. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the table and picked up my coffee cup and held it with both hands. The cup was warm. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Cardinal landed on the fence post and looked at me through the glass like it was waiting for something. I sat there for a long time. My son's name is Robert. He's 41 years old. He has a good job, a nice house out in Franklin, and a wife named Diane who has never once looked me in the eye for more than 3 seconds. I've known this for years. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that just how some people are, a little cold, a little guarded. I made excuses. I kept showing up. I kept writing the checks. That's the part I need to tell you about, the checks. Because this isn't just a story about a Thanksgiving invitation. This is a story about 31 years of showing up for someone who had already decided, somewhere along the way, that I was optional. My wife, Margaret, passed 11 years ago. Breast cancer. She was 53. Robert was 30 at the time, already living with Diane, already a little distant. But grief does strange things to families, and I told myself the distance was part of that. I gave it time. I gave it patience. I gave it money when money was needed, which turned out to be more often than I expected. Robert had started a small contracting business around that time. He came to me in the first year after his mother died, hat in hand, said he needed capital to buy equipment, $40,000. I had it. Margaret and I had saved carefully for 30 years. She was a school librarian. I drove a delivery route for 22 years before my knees gave out and I moved to dispatcher. We didn't live large. We lived steady. And we saved. I gave him the $40,000. No contract, no repayment schedule. He was my son. 2 years later, he came back. The business had grown, but cash flow was tight. Could I help with payroll for a few months? I gave him $18,000. He said he'd pay it back when the big contract came through. The big contract came through. The big contract came through. He bought a boat. I didn't say anything about the boat. 3 years after that, he and Diane wanted to renovate their kitchen. The quote was $62,000. His business was doing fine by then, but they were, as Diane explained to me at dinner one Sunday, the one dinner she sat next to me long enough to have a conversation, asset-rich and cash-poor. She said this with the confidence of someone who had never once worried about a light bill. I wrote a check for $30,000 and told them to treat the rest as a home equity loan, which they got and which I co-signed because Robert's credit had a blemish from the business's early years. He never made a single payment on that loan. I made them all. I want to be careful here. I'm not telling you this to make Robert sound like a monster. I'm telling you this because I think I trained him. I think every time I filled the gap without being asked twice, I taught him that the gap would always be filled. I taught him that I was a resource, not a father. And at some point, Diane learned it too. Or maybe she always knew. And she just confirmed what she already believed. That Walter was useful. Walter was quiet. Walter would not make trouble. I am 63 years old. I have a bad left knee and a good right one. I live in the same house Robert grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, a house that Margaret picked out and that I have maintained alone for 11 years. I refinished the hardwood floors myself. I repainted every room. I kept the garden the way she liked it, though I'll admit the roses near the back fence have gotten a little wild since last summer. I had been looking forward to Thanksgiving, not because of the food or even because of Robert specifically. I had been looking forward to it because my granddaughter, Lily, was going to be there. She's 7. She calls me Pop-Pop. She has Margaret's eyes, that particular shade of gray-green that I haven't seen on another human being since the morning I lost her. Lily doesn't know anything about checks or kitchen renovations or co-signed loans. She just knows that Pop pushes her on the swings and always has butterscotch candy in his left coat pocket. I had already bought her a birthday present. Her birthday is in December, but I found something at a craft fair in September. A little wooden jewelry box with her name painted on it, and a tiny ballerina inside that spins when you open the lid. I wrapped it early. It was sitting on the shelf in my bedroom. Hope you understand. Those 3 words. I kept coming back to those 3 words all morning. Not I'm sorry. Not this is hard for me too. Not even a phone call. A text. At 6:47 in the morning. On a Thursday. I thought about calling him. I picked up the phone twice. Both times I put it back down. Because I knew what would happen. Robert would get defensive. Diane would be somewhere in the background sharpening the silence, and I would end up apologizing for being upset about being told not to come to my own son's house for Thanksgiving. I've had that conversation before, in different forms. I know how it ends. Instead, I drove to the office of my attorney, a woman named Patricia Chen, who handled Margaret's estate and who has known me for 15 years. I didn't have an appointment. Her assistant, a young man named Marcus, told me she was between clients and could see me in 20 minutes. I sat in the waiting room and read a magazine article about fishing in Montana that I did not retain a single word of. Patricia is a small woman with sharp glasses and the kind of stillness that makes you feel like she has already considered every possible outcome of whatever you're about to say. I sat down across from her desk and I told her everything. The 40,000, the 18,000, the 30,000, and the loan. The years of holidays where I drove 40 minutes to sit at a table where I was tolerated. The text that morning. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she took her glasses off and set them on the desk. "Walter," she said, "what do you want to do?" I told her. She put her glasses back on. "I want to tell you that I went home and felt righteous. I want to tell you it was easy. It wasn't. I sat in my car in Patricia's parking lot for 15 minutes, and I looked at a photograph I keep in my wallet. Robert at age 9, missing his 2 front teeth, holding up a fish he caught at Lake Jordan like it was the greatest achievement in the history of the world. His mother is standing next to him laughing. I am behind the camera, which is why you can't see me, but I remember exactly where I was standing. I drove home and I made a list. It was a practical list. The kind Margaret would have appreciated. She was a list person. She believed that a thing written down was a thing you could actually do something about. The list had 4 items on it. By noon, I had done 3 of them. The first was calling my bank and removing Robert as the secondary contact on my checking and savings accounts. He was on there from years ago, added during a health scare I had in 2019. Nothing serious, but it shook me, and I'd added him as a precaution. I had never thought much about it since. The banker was a young woman named Keisha, who was professional and kind and did not ask me any questions I didn't want to answer. The second was calling the loan servicer. The home equity loan I had co-signed had 11 months left on it. I had been making the payments for 3 years. I stopped the automatic transfer and sent a certified letter that same afternoon, notifying Robert that effective the 1st of next month, the payment responsibility was returning to the account holder of record, which was him. The third was calling Patricia back and telling her to proceed with what we had discussed in her office. This house, the one with the roses in the back and the hardwood floors I refinished myself, had been in my name and Margaret's name, and when she passed it had become solely mine. I had never discussed this with Robert, but I am aware, because I am not naive, that he assumed it would come to him. People assume things about their parents' houses. I understand that. I had probably let him assume it, the same way I had let him assume it, the same way I had let him assume a lot of things. Patricia was going to change the beneficiary in my estate documents. The house, and whatever remained of my savings after the mortgage was settled, would go to the Raleigh Public Library Foundation, with one specific allocation, a children's literacy fund, to be named after Margaret. The 4th item on my list I held off on until evening. I needed to sit with it. It wasn't a financial matter. It was harder than the financial matters. At 7 o'clock, I wrote a letter to Robert, not a text. A letter, on paper, in my handwriting. I'm not going to tell you everything I wrote in it because some of it is mine and I intend to keep it that way. But I'll tell you the parts that matter. I told him I had received his message. I told him I understood. I told him that for the first time in many years, I was going to take him at his word, that things were just easier this way, and I was going to act accordingly. I told him I would not be attending Thanksgiving or Christmas or any gathering where my presence needed to be negotiated around other people's comfort. I told him that the financial arrangements we had maintained were concluded, and that I wished him and Diane well in resolving the matters I had transferred back to them. Then I wrote one more paragraph, and this is the part that took me the longest, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp on and the house quiet around me. I told him I loved him. I told him I had loved him every day of his life. I told him that love was not the same thing as availability, and that I had confused the two for long enough that I owed him the distinction. I told him that my door was not closed. I told him the door had never been about him. It had always been about what he was willing to walk through it as. I sealed the envelope. I put a stamp on it. I walked to the mailbox at the end of the street in the dark, and I put it in and I raised the flag. Then I stood there for a minute in the October cold, just breathing. A week passed, then 2 weeks. Robert did not call. The certified letter about the loan was received. I have the delivery confirmation, but there was no response. I thought about Lily, about the wooden jewelry box on my shelf, and I thought about what it means to love someone you can't reach through other people. I decided to mail the jewelry box directly to Lily at Robert's address, wrapped in brown paper with a card that said only, "Happy early birthday, sweetheart. Love, Pop Pop." No message to Robert. No message to Diane. That gift was between me and my granddaughter, and it did not require anyone else's permission. About 3 weeks after I sent the letter, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't pick up. I'm glad I did. It was Robert's older cousin, my nephew Marcus, who I have always been close to. Marcus is 46 and lives in Durham, and is one of the steadiest people I have known since his father, my brother, passed 8 years ago. Marcus said he'd heard from Robert. Said Robert had called him, which surprised Marcus because Robert rarely calls anyone. "He didn't sound good, Uncle Walter," Marcus said. I told him I was sorry to hear that. He wanted me to talk to you. Said there'd been a misunderstanding. I was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the cardinal was back on the fence post. Or maybe it was a different cardinal. I've never been able to tell. "Marcus," I said, "I don't believe there was a misunderstanding. I think the message was very clear. I think my response was very clear. What I think happened is that the consequences were different than expected." Marcus was quiet on his end. "That's not a misunderstanding," I said. "That's just information." He exhaled slowly. "I hear you," he said. "Then how are you doing?" Actually, nobody had asked me that. Not in weeks. I had to think about it for a second, which is not always a good sign, but this time it was. "I'm all right," I said. "I'm sleeping better than I have in years." He laughed, short and warm. "Good," he said. "That's good, Walter." We talked for another hour about nothing in particular. Football, the weather, a fishing trip he was planning in the spring. Before we hung up, he told me he'd like to come down around Christmas, if I'd have him. I told him to bring his daughter. I told him I'd make Margaret sweet potato pie, and he said that alone was worth the drive from Durham. After I hung up, I sat for a while in the good quiet that is different from the empty quiet. Margaret used to say there were 2 kinds of silence. The silence of something missing and the silence of something settled. I used to ask her how you could tell the difference. She'd look at me over her reading glasses with that particular expression she had, like the answer was obvious and she was just being patient with me. "One of them feels like holding your breath," she said. "The other feels like letting it out." I've thought about that a lot over these past weeks. 31 years of holding my breath at kitchen tables, in driveways, on phone calls that ended before I had said what I meant to say. 31 years of making myself smaller so that the distance between us felt like something other than what it was. I don't know what happens next with Robert. That part of the story isn't finished, and I've made my peace with not knowing the ending. Maybe he calls. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe Lily grows up and finds me on her own terms, the way children sometimes do when they get old enough to choose their people. I've left the door the way I described in my letter, not closed, just honest about what it requires to walk through. What I know is this. I know what it feels like to drive 40 minutes to sit at a table and feel like a guest. I know what it feels like to read a text message that treats 30 years of love like a scheduling inconvenience. And I know now, clearly, in a way I did not know on the morning of that Wednesday, before the Thursday that changed things, that I am not required to keep subsidizing my own irrelevance. I am 63 years old. My knees aren't what they were, but the rest of me is fine. I have a house with roses in the back that have gotten a little wild, and I have decided I like them that way. I have a nephew who wants to come for Christmas, and a granddaughter who got a jewelry box in the mail, and who, according to Marcus, carried it around the house for 2 days before she'd let anyone else touch it. I have Margaret's name on a library fund that will be buying books for children in the city for as long as the fund exists. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. The morning after I mailed the letter, I woke up before the alarm, which I haven't done in years. I made coffee and I sat at the kitchen table and I watched the light come in through the back window, low and slow, the way it does in October. I didn't read the electric bill. I just sat there and breathed out, and it felt exactly the way Margaret said it would.